You know that feeling when everyone finally leaves the office? Or the meeting ends and you close the door? Or it's Saturday morning and your phone is quiet and the thing you've been struggling with all week suddenly starts to move. Not because the problem got easier, because you did. The ideas come faster, the connections form differently. The work that felt stuck in a group suddenly has room to breathe. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a voice says, "Why can't it always feel like this?" That's not antisocial behavior. That's not a preference you need to apologize for or explain away in a team retrospective. That's your brain operating in the conditions it actually needs to do its best work. And the fact that those conditions happen to involve fewer people is not a character flaw. It's a cognitive reality. Here's what nobody tells you about people who work better alone. They call you a poor collaborator. You're actually someone whose best thinking requires an environment that most open-plan offices, most standing meetings, and most "let's align on this" cultures were never designed to provide. The "not a team player" label follows people like you around. But there's a specific thing that label always misses. Your output doesn't drop because you don't care about the work. It drops because the conditions suppress the thinking. Remove the conditions, the output recovers. That's not a personality flaw. That's a measurement problem. Difficult to work with usually just means produces better work outside the process the team agreed to use. You're not bad at teams. You're bad at performing in the conditions most teams create. Here's the thing. There's a well-documented phenomenon in psychology called social facilitation. The observation that the presence of others affects performance in predictable and measurable ways. For simple, well-practiced tasks, social presence tends to enhance performance. For complex, creative, or cognitively demanding tasks, it tends to suppress it. The research behind this goes back over a century to psychologist Norman Triplett's 1898 observations and has been replicated consistently across cultures, contexts, and task types. What this means in practice is straightforward. The kind of work that requires deep thinking, novel connections, sustained concentration, or original synthesis, the kind of work that most knowledge workers are actually hired to do, is precisely the kind of work that other people's presence most reliably disrupts. Not because your colleagues are a problem, because your brain, when it knows it's being observed, allocates a portion of its processing capacity to social monitoring, to tracking expressions, managing impressions, anticipating reactions. That capacity is not available for the work. And in cognitively demanding tasks, that portion matters. But then there's something else happening here. Underneath the performance difference is a second layer that almost nobody talks about honestly in professional settings. It's not just that you think more clearly alone. It's that alone, you're allowed to be wrong in ways that groups don't permit. You can follow a line of thinking that doesn't go anywhere. You can change your mind 3 times in 20 minutes. You can sit with confusion long enough for something useful to emerge from it, without the social pressure to arrive at a conclusion before the meeting ends. Groups, by their nature, compress the thinking process. They create pressure toward premature convergence, toward the answer that can be reached together, in the time available, at the level of shared understanding in the room. And that answer is almost never the best possible answer. It's the best available answer given the constraints. The person who works better alone isn't avoiding collaboration. They're protecting the part of the thinking process that collaboration most reliably destroys. Have you ever had your best idea in the shower the morning after a brainstorming session that produced nothing? That's not coincidence. That's your brain finally getting the conditions it needed to finish what the meeting started. Now here's where it gets interesting. The preference for solitary work has been systematically pathologized in modern workplace culture in a way that has almost nothing to do with performance and almost everything to do with visibility. Collaborative work is visible. It happens in rooms, on calls, in shared documents with comment trails and edit histories. It produces artifacts that demonstrate participation. It signals, in the language most organizations have learned to read, that you are engaged, aligned, and present. Solitary work produces better output, but it produces it invisibly. And in organizations that measure engagement through observable behavior, who's in the meetings, who's contributing in the open forum, who's physically present and visibly active, the person who disappears to do their best thinking will always look less committed than the person who performs their thinking in public, even when the work speaks clearly for itself. Researcher Susan Cain, in her study of introversion and creative performance, found that solitary work environments consistently produce higher quality output for complex cognitive tasks than group brainstorming, a finding that has been replicated repeatedly but has had almost no effect on how most organizations are actually designed. The open plan persists. The mandatory brainstorm persists. The culture of visible collaboration persists. Not because the evidence supports it, because it is easier to manage what you can see. But let's clear something up. This is not an argument against collaboration. There are things that only happen when people work together. The challenge of an assumption you didn't know you were making. The connection between two people's knowledge that neither would have reached alone. The momentum that a shared commitment creates. Those things are real, and they matter. What's not real is the idea that all work benefits equally from collaboration. That presence in a room is evidence of contribution. That the person who needs solitude to do their best thinking is contributing less than the person who does their thinking out loud. The research does not support that. The output does not support that. The only thing that supports it is a workplace culture that learned to equate visibility with value, and has never had much reason to question whether those two things are actually the same. They are not the same. And you have probably known that for a long time. Here's what they don't tell you. The hours you spend working alone, the early mornings, the closed doors, the headphones, the deliberate removal of yourself from the collaborative noise, those are not hours you're spending away from work. Those are the hours where the actual work happens. You don't work better alone because something is wrong with you. You work better alone because something is right about how your brain processes complexity. And that was always worth knowing, whether or not the culture ever got around to saying it. Think about every time you've been pulled into a meeting that could have been an email. Every brainstorm that ended with the loudest voice winning. Every moment of genuine progress that happened not during the collaboration, but after it. When you finally had a minute alone to actually think. Those weren't accidents. That was your mind finding its way back to the conditions it needed. And the fact that you had to find workarounds, had to carve out the solitude, had to protect the thinking time from the calendar, that's not a sign of poor teamwork. That's a sign of someone who knew, even without the language for it, what good work actually requires. The hours in the meeting are often where the work gets discussed. The hours alone are where it gets done. Now tell me, when do you actually do your best thinking? And how much of your working day does that environment actually represent? Drop it in the comments. And if this video finally gave language to something you've been justifying to other people for years, hit subscribe. We're here every week breaking down the psychology of work that nobody talks about. Because understanding why you are the way you are, that's not just interesting, that's powerful.